All right, let us get started. So hello everyone and welcome to the closing session of this academic year at the Israeli Forum of Early Medieval Studies. Today we're honored to have here with us Professor Emeritus Ian Wood of the University of Leeds. Before I introduce Professor Wood, I just wish to remind you all that this session and the following discussion are being recorded and will be uploaded to the forum's Facebook page and YouTube channel. We encourage you to follow us on social media. So in addition to Facebook, we have a new Instagram account. So please check us out. The links appear in the comment section below. Now, may I introduce Professor Ian Wood. Professor Wood is a leading scholar of late Roman culture, the Merovingian dynasty, and the missionary efforts in the early Middle Ages. Professor Wood was elected a fellow of the British Academy in 2019. He held guest professorships at the universities of Vienna and Aarhus, and he was also affiliated with the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in 1995 and the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies in 2017, as well as the British School at Rome in 2006 and the University of Tübingen in 2019. Professor Wood was granted the British Academy Research Leadership in 2005, as well as a grant from the AHRC in 2009, and from HERA, together with Professor Walter Paul and Professor Micah de Jong, which I'm sure I've seen in this session. So Professor Wood is the author of many books of various genres. So he has monographs, translations, historiographical research, and co-authored books. Among his most awarded books are The Modern Origins of the Early Middle Ages, The Merovingian Kingdoms 450 to 751, and The Abbots of Wearmouth and Jarrow, which he co-authored with Chris Brockert. Today, Professor Wood will talk of his book, The Transformation of the Roman West, issued in the Past Imperfect series, and aims to present a concise and critical overview of such a massive and vital topic. We will have time for questions after the talk. So if you have a question for Professor Wood, please send me, More Hachby, a message with your name, and I'll ask you to present your question. Or alternatively, you can send the question and I will read it. That being said, Professor Wood, thank you for agreeing to be here, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, More. Before I start, just a word, because our internet connection is a bit uncertain here. There is a recording already that I made with More the other day. So there is a fallback if there's a crisis. It also meant that I didn't actually try to do anything clever with any sort of PowerPoint. I apologize for that, but there is a handout for all of you, which I think More has already put on the, or circulated and put into the chat column. But that was just to make sure that the my words were not suddenly interrupted with some glitch in the sound system. So first, I would like to thank More Hagby and Shachar Orlinsky for the invitation to contribute to this series of lectures. And I'd also like to thank my old friend Yitzhak Hen, who I believe suggested that they should contact me. It's a great honor and a pleasure to contribute, and also an interesting challenge to revisit some of my own recent work. My book on the transformation of the Roman West, 2018, is a concise assessment of what I see as the major lines of development between the beginning of the 4th and the end of the 7th centuries. It originated in the plenary lecture, Religion and the End of the Roman West, that I gave at Kalamazoo in 2016. Which was an attempt to assess the significance of religious developments in the so-called fall of the West Roman Empire. But the greater space afforded by publication in book form, however short the book, allowed me the opportunity to attempt to balance the roles of religion with those of the failure of the state and of the impact of the barbarian migrations in the history of late antiquity. Indeed, the intellectual issue that has bothered me most in recent decades is how to hold in balance the undoubted insights of Peter Brown on religion, Walter Goffert on the barbarians, and Chris Wickham, among others, on the economy. The book has little to say about the political divisions which undoubtedly contributed to the collapse of the Roman West. something which has been very well dealt with in recent years by the likes of Henning Byrne, Christine Delaplace, Ralph Matheson, Megan McAvoy, J.M. O'Flynn, Fabrizio Opedisano, and Hiron Weinendahler. It's a topic that I said something about in a paper which has unfortunately only appeared in Chinese, although I hope the English text will appear next year, and to which I've returned in a volume already in draft for Oldenburg. Like several others, I see the divisions among the Romans as being far more important than the arrival of the barbarians in the political collapse of the empire. But I would also argue that politics are relatively insignificant when trying to examine the differences between Western Europe in 300 and in 650. I also tend to downplay the question of religious division, at least for the West, although I accept that the Nestorian and Monophysite crises were damaging for the East. Despite the views of Victor of Vita and Gregory of Tours, Arianism does not loom large in my explanation of developments. Although there was certainly persecution in Vandal Africa, Homoian rulers elsewhere were rarely in conflict with the Roman population over religious issues. The friendly disagreements between Avitus of Vienne and the Burgundian ruler Gundobad are a good illustration of the standard modus vivendi, and surely shed more light on the realities of the early 6th century than Gregory of Tours' presentation of Clovis. The doctrinal debates of the late antique West are interesting, but they are not a major factor in the collapse of Rome or of the establishment or fall of any one barbarian kingdom. But while I downplay doctrinal debate, I see the rise of Christianity with all the socio-economic changes it entailed as the central development of the period. My short book begins with Gibbon, not simply because of the standard and incorrect view that the historiography of the fall of the Roman Empire begins with his work, but rather because he seems to me to provide an exemplary attempt to cover the full range of the changes involved in the period from the 3rd to the 7th century. For Gibbon, the chief causes of the collapse of the Western Empire were, I quote, religion and barbarism, end of quote. But he also found space to consider, I quote, the disorders of military despotism, the foundation of Constantinople, and the division of the monarchy, end of quote. Work on my previous book on the modern origins of the early Middle Ages, published in 2013, had left me with a sense that the interpretative traditions dealt with in the fall of the West Roman Empire, most notably of the role of the barbarians, the Roman state, and the church, had each gone their separate ways. In particular, revisiting Gibbon and discovering Antoine Frédéric Ozanam made me realize how much more all-embracing were their readings than the majority of their counterparts writing over the past half-century. One major exception from the 1930s is Christopher Dawson, who I suspect took most of his ideas from Ozanam, albeit without acknowledgement. My solution to the problem of trying to hold Brown, Goffert, and Wickham in some sort of equilibrium was to resort to number crunching, which allowed me to embark upon a juxtaposition of developments in religion and the economy, and also in the makeup of the population caused by the Völkerwanderung. For the 4th and 5th centuries, what number crunching reveals is first that Goffert's downplaying of the barbarian migrations is unquestionably correct, even if one takes the numbers of barbarians given in the sources at face value. Many scholars who have counted barbarians have not compared those numbers, which suggest 80,000 as the upper limit of each of the 4 major barbarian groups, Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, and Lombards, even after they had absorbed other defeated peoples. With the figures we have for the inhabitants of the empire, often reckoned to have been around 55 million. Its administrators and its armed forces. The Franks I leave on one side. How many of them actually originated outside the empire is extremely unclear. In origin, they were very much a Rhineland people. For the 7th century, the figures I analysed were not those of the overall population, which are highly questionable, not least because of current disagreements about the impact of the plague, nor of the military, which would be meaningless since outside the Byzantine world, we're dealing with armies of obligation. And indeed, there is no evidence that any sizable army was put into the field between the period of the Lombard settlement and the arrival of the Berbers in Spain in 711. Instead, I counted clergy. And what's striking is the sheer number of clerics and religious to be found in Western Europe by the 7th century, and the fact that they are pretty well comparable to the number of the Roman military in circa 300. Looking at the information in the starkest of terms, in circa 300, the Roman world was dominated by the needs of the military. The army, which numbered between 400,000 and 600,000 at the time of Diocletian and Constantine, had to be paid for because it was a standing army and not an army of obligation. This and the number of bureaucrats, which Christopher Kelly reckoned at 34,000, which is almost certainly an underestimate if one includes the more menial administrators, determined the fiscal needs of the state. By circa 650, there was no standing army except in the Byzantine world, and the state bureaucracy was greatly reduced. Instead, the sub-Roman world was dominated by the needs of the church. Here one can guess that on average, each of the 1,800 dioceses noted by Gibbon was staffed by around 100 senior clergy, that is, clergy down to the level of deacon, and that this figure was eclipsed by the number of monks and nuns. The numbers of clerics and religious in 650 would seem to have been roughly equivalent to the numbers of the military in 300, especially if one makes some allowance for what was almost certainly a decline in the overall size of the population. Clearly, the shift from a world dominated by the army and the state to one dominated by the church had huge implications for the economy. Although the development of the spiritual and even the socio-religious importance of the church has been mapped with extraordinary nuance by Peter Brown and a number of scholars inspired by his work, it seems to me that the implications of this have rarely permeated readings of the 7th century as a whole. Brown and others have put the notion of the spiritual economy firmly on the map, but for most people, that economy is not one of hard cash or property, but of spiritual transactions. Moreover, the secular state still seems to dominate the majority of categorizations of the period, even when the word state or Staat is itself being questioned. Konrad Leiser has cried out for us to abandon the centrality of the secular state in our interpretations, and his appeal is one with which I concur, although I would argue that we should not ditch the concept of the state entirely when considering the post-Roman world, so as to avoid the impression that the West collapsed into barbarism. Much of what had fallen to the state in the Roman period, however, now fell to the church. Micah de Jong has placed the concept of ecclesia at the heart of the Carolingian world. The origins of this model of society clearly began earlier. In order to conceptualize the changes that took place between 300 and 650, I've turned to social anthropology and have used some of its modeling to try to characterize the end of late antiquity. That has led me to consider the value of the model or models of the temple society and whether those models are of use. And here I found the work of John Holden inspirational. For a Marxist, the temple society is a subset of the Asiatic mode of production, itself a variant of the feudal mode. Not surprisingly, given its name, it is a model that has been developed with regard to the societies of Southeast Asia. Holden has used the model to provide a contrast with the structures of Western Europe and Byzantium, whereas I've been struck by the extent to which the church-dominated society of the 7th century and later is actually comparable to the temple societies of India and Southeast Asia. This is something I explored in a lecture given in Bologna, which was published in the Rivista di Storia Antica in 2019, and to which I've returned in my forthcoming early medieval Europe lecture, given at the Leeds IMC in 2019 and due to be published in the early autumn, as well as in a short book on the development of the ecclesiastical economy, which should appear in the near future. The fascicule of early medieval Europe that will include my Leeds lecture will also contain an extremely stimulating group of papers by other scholars, Konrad Leiser, Paolo Tedesco, Merle Eisenberg, Stefan Esders, Stefan Patzold, Corinne van Rijn, Roy Fleckner, and Janelle Fontaine, picking up on the idea of the temple society in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. There's a tendency in Western historiography and in Western thought more generally to regard Christianity as normal and other religious systems, with the possible exceptions of Judaism and Islam, as other. I would argue that whatever one's personal religious viewpoint, this is an uncritical stance. As an institution, the Christian church should be examined according to the same criteria that are applied to the institutions of other religions. And I would add here that in addition to discussions of Southeast Asia, some of the most helpful models in the understanding of temple societies are those that have been applied to the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New. My forthcoming book on the ecclesiastical economy addresses one of the questions left unanswered by the transformation of the Roman West, which is that of the chronology of ecclesiastical endowment and the related question of the chronology of the expansion of the numbers of clergy. Here, number crunching obviously comes into play once more. In the transformation of the Roman West, I provided estimates of the numbers of clergy and also the scale of ecclesiastical property holding around 600 or slightly later. These I had mapped out in a Royal Historical Society lecture, Entrusting Western Europe to the Church, 400 to 750, delivered in 2013. My conclusion in that lecture was that around a third of the territory of what had been the Roman West was in the hands of the church by the beginning of the 8th century. This was a figure that David Herlihy had reckoned was only achieved in Carolingian Francia in the 9th century. Although his 9th century figures command respect, he unfortunately ignored pretty well all the evidence for the 6th and 7th centuries. And some of the evidence, for instance, that for Le Mans, Saint-Wandrille, Saint-Denis, Saint-Martin, Tours, and Novalesa is unequivocal. Above all, the will of Bertram of Le Mans, gifting what can be calculated as 0.5% of the whole area of modern France to the churches of Le Mans, and the 4,288 mansi of Saint-Wandrille noted in the Gestra Bartum Fontanellensium provide striking indications of the landed wealth of the church. How one reconciles Herlihy's figures and mine seems to me to be a subject to be pursued. Of course, his Carolingian world includes territories that had not been part of the Roman world, and even in the 7th and 8th centuries, the church held very little property to the east of the Rhine. But with regard to what had been Roman, the discrepancy between our conclusions raises major questions about the 8th century, some of which, I should add, are addressed by Stefan Patzold and Corinne van Rijn in the forthcoming fascicule of early medieval Europe. The history of the expansion of church property is one that's been remarkably neglected by scholars. A.H.M. Jones commented in his History of the Later Roman Empire that the land holdings of the church, I quote, grew rapidly and steadily, end of quote, after the conversion of Constantine. And he illustrated his point with a reference to the donations made by emperors, notably by Constantine in the Liber Pontificalis, to the gifts of the members of the senatorial aristocracy, exemplified by those of Melania and Pinion, and to the evidence of papyri, which for the West essentially means those of Ravenna. This is not a very impressive body of evidence, especially given the fact that the relevant Ravenna papyri all date from the 6th century. Jones's article on church finances in the 5th and 6th centuries does not supply any further evidence for the period before 500. The evidence for Melania and Pinion is striking, and it actually points to a very different conclusion from that deduced by Jones. When the senatorial couple arrived in Africa in 410, they set about distributing vast amounts of treasure to the church, and particularly to the Church of Thagaste. At this point, Augustine intervened, asking them not to give treasure, but to give land, since estates would provide a long-term endowment, whereas gold and silver would very quickly be exhausted. Melania was persuaded to do as the Bishop of Hippo asked. But when she moved on to the Holy Land, she instantly reverted to her previous pattern of giving, bestowing 45,000 solidi on the poor, 10,000 on the Church of Palestine, and 15,000 on the Church of Antioch. It would seem then that charity and the endowment of religion was thought of in terms of giving coin and treasure, not in terms of giving property to the church. This is, of course, what is urged in the New Testament. Christ tells his followers to sell everything and distribute the money raised to the poor. In the Acts of the Apostles, the community in Jerusalem was supported by gifts of money. The New Testament model of religious endowment involved the transfer of coin and treasure, not the transfer of land. This suited the Jerusalem community very well. A small body of believers with no priesthood to support only required ready money to cover its daily needs, but it did not need regular income to cover the costs of a class of people whose prime duty was to officiate over a religious cult. Melania and Pinion, and indeed several contemporary benefactors of the church, were doing what they were called to do in the Bible. This may well have been the normal mode of religious benefaction in the early 5th century. It was not only the New Testament community that was funded in this way. In the Old Testament, the books of Numbers and of Deuteronomy both state that the priestly tribe of Levi should not possess land. Moreover, Roman religion was, for the most part, paid for not by the income derived from landholding, but by gifts of treasure. Although some pagan temples have had property over and above the land on which they stood, this, so far as we can see from the surviving documentation, was not the norm. In the period of the Roman Empire, unlike the earlier Hellenistic period, temples were not endowed with extensive estates. Indeed, the jurist Ulpian stated that men should not make the gods their heirs, with the exceptions of Tarpeian Jove, Apollo of Didyma, Mars in Gaul, Minerva Iliensis, Hercules of Cadiz, Diana of Ephesus, the Magnesian mother of the gods, Nemesis of Smyrna, and Astarte of Carthage. Treasure, on the other hand, was offered to the gods in vast quantities, as is clear from a remarkable inscription surviving from the temple of Isis at Nemi, which lists the gifts offered to the goddess. This, as Paolo Liverani has noted, looks remarkably similar to the lists of treasures given by Constantine to the basilicas of Rome. The gift of treasure, though not the gifts of land, listed in the Liber Pontificalis, conformed to the standard Roman way of supporting religion in the period from the Republic down to the 4th century. The lists included in the Liber Pontificalis constitute what Jones presents as the point of departure for the landed endowment of the Church. There are, however, considerable problems in accepting their authenticity. I would not wish to challenge the fact that Constantine funded the Basilica of St. John Lateran and made some endowments to Roman churches. Nor would I wish to deny that Roman churches had possession of the treasures and properties listed in the Liber Pontificalis by the late 6th century. But how much of that endowment actually came from Constantine is extremely questionable. First, as Liverani has pointed out, some of the lists of Constantinian donations include the term tremesis in the valuation. Since the tremesis was introduced by Theodosius in the 380s, these entries cannot be Constantinian in date, nor indeed can they belong to the first 3/4 of the 4th century. Equally, Federico Montinaro has noted that one of the African estates held by the Lateran baptistry is named after a barbarian, probably a Vandal, which would seem to suggest the endowment postdates the settlement of the Vandals in Africa, and perhaps even the Justinianic reconquest. At the very least, we have to conclude that the lists of Constantinian donations include interpolations assigning later gifts to the first Christian emperor. I would, however, go further than that. Since the normal pattern of religious endowment prior to the 4th century was the donation of treasure, the development of the concept of a landed religion was effectively revolutionary. despite Ulpian's list of gods who might receive inheritances, and despite the fact that we have some inscriptions from Lydia and Phrygia to show that some temples did have properties that they exploited for the provision of feasts. It's unlikely that this revolution in the notion of religious endowment was fully achieved in Constantine's reign, and it's unlikely to have begun before Constantine left Rome for the east. Indeed, after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, apart from a short visit to the city in 315, he's scarcely attested in being present in Rome. Richard Westall has pointed out that the properties in the Eastern Diocese cannot have been given before 324 and probably date to the reign of Constantius II. I would accept that the lists of treasure to be found in the Liber Pontificalis largely reflect what was given by Constantine and Constantius, who I think is far more likely to have been the benefactor of a number of the churches supposedly supported by his father. But I would argue that we should understand the property lists as being those of estates held by Roman churches by the later 6th century, which for ideological reasons were ascribed to Constantine. In addition to questioning the authenticity of the lists of property donation, we need to be aware of the problematic ascription of some ecclesiastical foundations to Constantine rather than Constantius. As is well known, some manuscripts of the Liber Pontificalis attribute to Constantius the foundation of the original San Paolo fuori le mura, itself a very much less imposing building than the Theodosian edifice that followed. More surprisingly, Westall has shown that bricks used in the building of St. Peter's belonged to the reign of Constantius, not to that of Constantine, and that other evidence, including coins, points to the construction in the years 357 to 9. Building at St. Peter's, in other words, was part of Constantius's support for the pro-Homoian anti-pope Felix, a pope who can be shown from other evidence to be completely misrepresented in the Liber Pontificalis. The impact of Constantius on the religious topography of Rome is a subject to which I hope to return in the coming months. If we leave aside the lists of property in the Liber Pontificalis, treating them only as providing evidence for papal landholding in the 6th century, and if we recognize the evidence for Melania and Pinian's donations as being indicative of a preference for giving treasure rather than land, the main evidence for the expansion of ecclesiastical property holding provided by Jones, that of the Ravenna papyri, relates to the period after 500. Although the Egyptian papyri do provide some examples of land donation before then. The other surviving evidence for the West, not cited by Jones, points in a similar direction. Although the great diocesan histories of Le Mans, Auxerre, and Reims, and also of Ravenna were compiled in the Carolingian period, the wills that they reproduce, some of which are unquestionably genuine, although some are not, provide good evidence for the endowment of the church with landed estates from the 6th century onwards, but not earlier. In other words, although some land was unquestionably conveyed to the church by both Constantine and Constantius, the development of the church as a major landed institution belongs not to the years immediately after Constantine, but to the 5th and above all the 6th century. The emergence of a notion of a church funded by the income from property, I would argue, is a quite extraordinary religious revolution, which determined the nature of medieval Europe down to the 16th century, when the Reformation, at least in the Protestant areas of Western Europe, destroyed the socio-economic basis of the medieval church. The causes of the revolution in the endowment of religion require a good deal of study, and I can do no more than point to what seemed to me to be the dominant factors. The need to provide for the clergy, which went hand in hand with the expansion of clerical numbers, together with the church's liturgical obligations and provision of pastoral care. The first point is particularly important, although it was not something that happened overnight. As we've noted, the leaders of the Jerusalem community after the death of Christ were not full-time pastors. The developments of the duties of the priesthood was slow, and even in the 5th and 6th centuries, there was an expectation that a priest might be able to provide for himself by the work of his hands. Gradually, however, the demands of clerical office, which involved presiding over cult and carrying out duties of pastoral care, grew to the extent that many, if not all, priests had to be supported by the church itself or by the local community. Moreover, pastoral care was itself extremely costly, since it covered not just cult, but also support for the poor, for widows and orphans, for the sick, and for the ransom of prisoners and support for refugees. These last obligations were particularly onerous in the 5th and 6th centuries, as has been pointed out in several recent studies. And this is surely the chief explanation for the church's growing landed endowment: necessity. As so often, Augustine was remarkably prescient. The church needed a reliable and constant source of income. A parallel development can be seen with regard to ascetics. While an Egyptian hermit might support himself through such activities as basket weaving, the religious communities of Western Europe, and particularly those that promoted liturgical cult rather than work on the land, needed a more reliable source of revenue. Alongside the expansion of clerical and monastic duties, we're dealing with an explosion of the numbers of religious. Charting the expansion of clerical numbers from 300 to 600 is difficult, although clearly there must have been an expansion as more churches and more monasteries were founded. The figures that are offered in the Transformation of the Roman West took as their point of departure the numbers of ecclesiastical dioceses in the empire. Essentially, Gibbon's 1,800 episcopal pulpits is a good estimate. Of these, around 1,000 were in the West, and if we confine ourselves to Europe, we know of around 250 dioceses in Italy, 130 in Gaul, 80 in Spain, and perhaps 24 in Britain. North Africa had many more, at least 470 Catholic dioceses. Establishing the number of clergy is a good deal more problematic. We have snapshots for individual dioceses. For Rome, we have the lists of consecrations and ordinations provided by the Liber Pontificalis, although these allow only a rough indication of how many clergy there were at any one time. The norm, as listed in the Book of Pontiffs, was for around 3 priests to be ordained each year, although I suspect that not all ordinations are listed. The numbers provided by the Liber Pontificalis are surprisingly very much lower than the number of priests ordained each year in the Diocese of Le Mans, as recorded in the Actus Pontificum Canemanis, where the average is closer to 10. Occasionally, we have an anecdote which allows us to be more specific. We know of 70 priests in Rome in 418 and 67 in 499. 10 priests as well as 11 deacons were involved in an ecclesiastical lawsuit in Ravenna in circa 530. And clearly this was not the sum total of the clergy in the diocese. And Arnold Burschel estimated the overall number of the city's priests to be between 60 and 80. 34 priests signed the canons of the Diocesan Council of Auxerre in the late 6th century. Sometimes the numbers of known churches in a city or diocese provide additional information. In Rome, we know of 8 major basilicas, 28 titular churches, 31 non-titular churches, 14 oratories and chapels, and 11 monasteries and xenodochia within the orbs by the end of the 7th century, and an additional 7 major basilicas, 32 smaller churches, and 12 monasteries in the suburbium. Tom Brown has estimated that there were 72 churches and 20 monasteries in Ravenna by the end of the 8th century. Margareta Weidemann has noted references to 90 churches in Le Mans in the Actus Pontificum Canemanis, while Claire Stancliffe has counted 68 churches, monasteries, and oratories in the Diocese of Tours. By my calculation, on average, a Western diocese probably had a complement of around 100 senior clergy, bishops, priests, and deacons at the end of the 6th century. But clearly there was a good deal of variation. In particular, it would seem that the figures for Africa, especially in the rural dioceses to the south, were often lower than that. Obviously, the number of clergy was not static. Overall, there was surely an increase between the 4th and 7th centuries. Although this may not have been the case in Rome, where Robert Wisniewski has argued that there were around 100 clergy in 500 and only 40 a century later because of the effect of war and of the plague. And if he's correct, and I'm certainly prepared to take his word, some churches in Rome did not have a permanent staff. Elsewhere, however, we can gain a sense of an increase in clerical numbers from what is known about church foundation. And here the information provided by Gregory of Tours, which suggests that the late 6th century was a significant period for the establishment of churches, is of great value. Gregory notes the foundation of 6 vicus churches by Martin, 5 by Brictius, 4 by Eustochius, and 6 by Perpetuus, which brings us down to circa 491. Then in the second half of the 6th century, Eustochius founded 3, while Gregory himself claims to have dedicated a considerable number. The church canons regularly stress the numbers to provide a priest for a new foundation. Stress the need to provide a priest for a new foundation. So these figures are a rough guide to the numbers of clergy in a diocese. It's easier to chart the rise in the numbers of monasteries and religious, at least in Gaul, because of the work of Friedrich Prinz and Hartmut Atzma. The latter's estimate of 220 monasteries in the Frankish kingdom by 600 and 550 in the early 8th century is universally accepted. Turning these figures into numbers of monks and nuns is rather more difficult, although Ulrich Bellier gathered most of the information for the Merovingian world in a 2-part article published in 1929 and 1930. Some houses clearly had hundreds of inmates, but others perhaps only 24 or more. For other regions, however, the documentation for the spread of monasticism and for the numbers of monks and nuns is very much weaker. Georg Jenal could only find evidence for 100 monasteries in Italy in the 6th century, while a mere 86 are known from Visigothic Spain. Whether this can be taken to indicate a greater enthusiasm for monasticism in Francia is questionable, although Lombard Italy may well have lagged behind in its foundations. Cassiodorus speaks of numerous unnamed monasteries in the south of Italy, which may have survived into the 7th century. In Spain, the disruption caused by the Islamic conquest must certainly be a factor in the poverty of our evidence. The religious and spiritual developments of the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries are pretty well known, although one can argue about the significance of individual monastic figures and traditions. Columbanus and the Columbanian tradition have been central to much recent debate. The social impact of these changes is also well registered. Ever since the 1960s, Peter Brown has been insistent on the need to consider religion and society together. The significance of the growth of the church for the economy and also for the political world is less often discussed. Although the spiritual economy, as opposed to the concrete issues of land and movable goods, has been at the heart of much important discussion in recent years. I would argue that an ecclesiasticization of society took place in the late 5th and particularly the 6th and 7th centuries, although arguably not before, despite the earlier intellectual ferment of the patristic age of Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine in the West and their counterparts in the East. And here the model of the temple society is a useful tool and helps us to move beyond the stark contrast between the military empire of Diocletian and the church-dominated world of the late 7th century, which I set out in the transformation of the Roman West. Anthropologists have defined the model in various different ways, and not all are in agreement. Among the most useful to my mind, however, is the definition given by Arion Apodorai and Carol Apodorai Breckenridge. And here I give quite a long quote from them. 1, the temple ritual makes little sense unless it's viewed as the expression of homage to the reigning deity who is conceived as a sovereign. 2, that this sovereign figure stands at the center of a set of moral and economic transactions, which constitute, in a specific ethno-sociological sense, a redistributive process. 3, that temple endowments provide the organizational framework within which individuals and corporate groups participate in this redistributive process and acquire distinct autonomous shares in its ritual and economic benefits. 4, that conflicts generated by this process between various such shareholders are resolved by an outside agency whose mandate is to protect the temple, thus fulfilling one of the primary requirements for human claims to royal status. End of quote. Much of this can be applied directly to the 7th century West. Church ritual is certainly an act of homage to the Christian God, who stands at the center of a set of moral and economic transactions. Ecclesiastical endowments and the pastoral duties which the church was expected to perform can be described as a redistributive process. And the rulers of the early medieval West were certainly expected to protect the church. Of course, some of this is applicable to the pagan world of the pre-Constantinian period. Diocletian certainly felt that he had to protect the interests of the gods. But as Chris Wickham explained in one of his first articles, setting out the value of Marxist theory for an understanding of what he called the other transition, the change from antiquity to the Middle Ages, Marx's modes of production, in reality perhaps better defined as modes of distribution, are never exclusive. Rather, there will be a dominant mode, and the dominant mode of the 3rd century empire, in which the state and its army were paramount, was not that of the temple society. By contrast, the Christian world of the 7th century conforms very closely to the model set out by Apodori and Apodori Breckenridge. Of course, there are aspects of 7th century society that cannot be fitted into their model, but Wickham's insistence on the notion of a dominant as opposed to an all-inclusive mode allows for such features. In some respects, my study of the transformation of the Roman West is a reformulation of the classic change described by Perry Anderson as passages from antiquity to feudalism, and by Wickham as the other transition. For Wickham, the transition of late antiquity is from the slave mode of production of the ancient world to that of feudalism dominated by labor services and rent. Without wanting to challenge the importance of such relations, I would argue that what is most distinctive about the post-Roman period is the centrality of the church. For Halden, feudalism is one version of the tributary mode of production, and another is the temple society. I would argue that it is this, rather than classic feudalism as defined by Marxist historians, that is the dominant mode in the post-Roman West. Not only was the church the dominant religious and cultural force in the period, it would also seem to have been the dominant economic force through the extent of its landholding and its role in the redistribution of wealth to the church itself and its personnel, to the upkeep of its buildings, and also to those it was charged with supporting, the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the captives. The period between the early 4th and the early 7th century had seen the triumph of Christianity, not just in terms of religious practice, but also in terms of its control of the economy. Churches taken together constituted the most significant landowners of the period, and the yields from the land funded the clergy and monks and nuns, as well as the liturgical and pastoral activities which they carried out. And the fact that they all had the same pastoral duties allows us to see these churches as a single body. This, to my mind, amounts to the existence of a temple society, which the pagan world of the 3rd century, for all its temples, was not. In the transformation of the Roman West, I attempted to map out the change from the early 4th century to the early 7th, and I stressed the distinction between the military empire of Diocletian and the ecclesiastical dominated world of the successor states. Looking further at the change, I placed more emphasis on the economic implications, which has led me to examine the chronology of church endowment, which seems to have escalated somewhat later than Jones thought. Trying to conceptualize the new order that had emerged by the 7th century has also led me to draw on the models developed by social anthropologists in their readings of the temple societies of Southeast Asia. Looked at in this way, the transformation of the Roman West is really an attempt to redefine what Wickham has termed the other transition, but to put the church as an institution at the heart of his model. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wood, for such a stimulating talk. And I have to admit, this is the second time I've been hearing this talk, and it's still as stimulating as it was the day before yesterday. I open the discussion, and we do have a comment. Just a sec. All right. So our first comment is from Professor Micah de Jong. Would you like to ask your question, or shall I read it?
I'll do it. We've been talking about this longer, Ian. It's wonderful to hear the whole thing set out again. I agree largely with you, but two things. Let's zoom in on that 6th century and see, what makes that so pivotal, huh? And the other thing is, if we're talking 6th century, it struck me that this is precisely the period in which, let's say, institutionalized youth recruitment in the church, gets going. Child oblation and derivatives thereof. This is the period of the rule of Benedict, and attempts to actually organize an entire monastic system around landholding rather than basket weaving. So I mean, I thought you might use my old child oblates as an extra argument. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. In the book that I've got coming out, I say more about well, certainly about monasticism in the 6th century. The 6th century is really absolutely pivotal. The other thing that I would say is it's also the century where you get very sustained needs to help orphans and the dispossessed, and you do need considerable amounts of money for that. And we do have, I mean, the stuff that Alan and Neil have done on episcopal crisis management is very clear on the importance of the late 5th and 6th century for ecclesiastical crisis management. But yeah, I mean, I think everything points in all sorts of ways to the 6th century, and it's interesting that clearly Salvian is in a sense prescient, just as Augustine was, but Salvian is complaining that nobody is giving property to the land, to the church. Oh. He's saying you should be giving property to the land, to the church, you're not. And Salvian really is the sort of the voice of things to come. We tend to read him as a sort of rather idiotic reactionary in the 5th century. In fact, he's totally prescient for the 6th and 7th centuries.
Really? Thanks.
Shaha?
Thank you very much, Professor Wood, for this fascinating talk. I do agree with you 100%. I think also from the perspective of slavery, I think we can see that things are changing with Christianity. When now slaveholders have to consider, the religion of the slave, and the slaves are seen, I think, as Christians, either in esse or in posse, and in that sense, I definitely agree with you. I wonder if, so now the church as a widespread institution is taking on these different social, almost like a welfare system approach. And I wonder if they merely step into a position that is no longer being occupied by the empire or by empire officials or whatever we want to call them, or are they making something completely anew, a social system completely from scratch, or from their Christian Weltanschauung?
I think there's quite a lot that's new. I mean, I think that if you go back to the third century or whatever, you've got the whole issue of evergetism, But evergetism never really dealt with the poor in the way that the church in the 6th century deals with the poor. I think that Peter Brown has been sort of crucial in helping us to understand the whole revolution in the understanding of how the poor were understood, so that the poor in the 6th century are something closer to what we understand as the poor, whereas the poor in the 3rd century are really aristocrats or the middle class who are just having a hard time of it. So I think there is the church welfare state, and I think it is a church welfare state. It goes further than anything that had happened before. It's certainly true that some cities felt certain obligations about keeping their citizens safe, but it was their citizens. It wasn't the poor, it wasn't the lower classes, it was the people who could vote on the town councils who were being kept safe. So I think the church goes further, and I think your point about slaves is right. That suddenly the slaves have to be recognized as human beings, and that really changes the whole area of what you have to what an institution like the church has to think it's responsible for.
Feel free to ask some questions. In the meantime, I've already asked many questions because we talked about it, but I was wondering, what are the consequences of examining the early medieval society as a temple society? Or basically, maybe alternatively, I'm asking for a preview of your new book. So
well, the book doesn't go quite, it doesn't pursue temple, well, it does pursue temple society. The book is much more a sort of really detailed study of what we can say about church finances. And I mean, it should be out in September. So that will be. Temple society, yeah, I noticed that Paolo Pachau was there, so I'm expecting some devilish question from him in a minute, condemning my use of Marx and probably saying that that I need to be anathematized in some. Well, no, I'm sure Marx wouldn't go in for anathematization, but just working on this and going. I mean, for a long time, I mean, Chris Wickham and I were exact contemporaries, and in a sense, we have been reacting in one way or another to each other over for almost 50 years. Well, for 50 years now. And I've, for a long time, found his theoretical articles, the articles on theory from the early 1980s, absolutely central, but have been trying to work out how one can put the church into this. And it was really sort of conversations with John Holden, and then John Holden sending me a whole batch of articles that he'd written, where he has been dealing with, in his work on global history, he's been reacting, or he's been invited to comment on studies of Southeast Asia, and sort of to what extent is the Temple Society model useful. And what I found interesting with John was that he hadn't actually made the connection that actually what Marxist, what we have in the 7th century West looks a damn sight closer to an Asiatic temple society than it does to classic feudalism. In fact, classic feudalism, people say that the temple society, the Asiatic mode of production, is an odd sort of byproduct, and we've got feudalism as the norm. I would say actually feudalism is rather a latent and insignificant development, whereas the temple society is a hugely significant development. You can get Paolo to jump in on that if you want.
Paolo?
Yeah, I do have a question. First of all, no type of anathema for you. I'm very glad to see how progressively you have been adopting a more Marxist theoretical point of view. But
I'm improving, am I?
So, but what I wanted to ask is about production. So you told us about how we can change from mode of production to mode of distribution, and I would say also mode of appropriation.
Yeah,
And
sure.
I was wondering, what can you say about how production, or actually I'm thinking of relations of production, how they change when the church assumes such a central role? Because I think that your argument is very persuasive, and I think that it's an important contribution to put something that was missing exactly between uh, uh, Roman tributary mode of production and then what you're calling classical feudalism. And I think that this type of temple society can sprung from the earlier, and then we can have the later. But I'm still thinking about what changed in production.
I'm not sure that there's a great change in, and even Chris in framing the early Middle Ages doesn't see a great change in production itself. I'm not sure that there's a great change in production. I think there's a huge change in distribution. And in fact, I mean, most of my forthcoming book is about distribution and about the whole importance of the fourfold distribution of church revenue, and what that means. It's very difficult, in a sense, we don't have evidence that tells us about the sort of how the stuff gets from the peasant to the church as opposed to the peasant to the aristocrat, except in the Tour documents. What we have lots of evidence about how the money and income that gets from the church is then redistributed to the clergy, to the building of churches, to the provision of cult, and so forth. So I think that, I mean, I would, that's one area where I wouldn't sort of challenge Chris at all. It seems to me that Chris, on actually the render of material from the agricultural worker up to the institution, that doesn't really change. The institution changes, and the distribution from the institution outwards changes, but I don't think there's a big change from the agrarian producer. But I might be wrong on that. I mean, we just don't have the evidence.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Christy Pavey.
Professor Wood, thank you so much for your talk. I appreciated hearing your take on these interesting changes. I have a question about rural clergy. So you mentioned some figures, estimates about how many clergy there were in particular dioceses. And I'd like to know first how you're calculating or estimating the number of rural clergy in particular. And second, if you see a difference in how their rural clergy versus urban clergy are obtaining their income, so land versus making baskets.
Well, in terms of numbers and stuff of rural clergy, that really depends from diocese to diocese. For instance, the figures that Claire Stancliffe put together for the Diocese of Tours are for the Diocese of Tours, because you can go through all the works of Gregory of Tours and you can find which churches belong throughout the diocese, because you can link them to certain vici and so forth. Other cities, you may just have a list of city churches, and you may not have any list of churches at all. For instance, Metz, we know that Metz has 39 churches inside the Urbs, but we have no idea how many churches there are in the rural areas. So we can't do that. And what you then have to do is to look at the church canons. And the church canons are pretty clear on the funding of, or on the creation of parishes, and on the need to provide an income to provide a priest and the income for the priest. Now there, it's not always clear whether an aristocrat founding a parish church is endowing the church permanently with land, or just endowing the church with a permanent income from a set of estates, or whether the founder is actually endowing the local priest with land. We don't know. I mean, all we have is the straightforward statements in the canons that a church has to be properly endowed so as to cover the upkeep of the church, so as to cover the cleric, and also it varies indeed from region to region. Spain is a bit different from Gaul, and Gaul is a bit different from Italy. But exactly how the quadripartite or the tertia is allocated. So you have to put together material which is really quite separate.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Now we have a question from Dennis Yukino. I will read. Some time ago, I attended a lecture on early Christianity. The speaker was very cautious, but when asked by the audience directly to what Christianity owed its successful spread up to the Edict of Milan, the lecturer, himself a believer but also an outstanding biblistic, commented cautiously that he would ascribe it to some popular cultural spiritual needs that Christianity fulfilled better than the previous cults. In light of your interpretation of the late Roman society as a temple society, how would you explain, however tentatively, the success of Christianity, or, put bluntly, what facilitated the transition from a non-temple to a temple society, and why was this transition not opposed by the masses?
Well, I would see Christianity before Constantine, and even to a large extent in the century or so after Constantine, as very much modeled on the Jerusalem community. So you, basically speaking, it is not funded from land or property, it is funded from gifts of treasure, which is exactly how any Roman pagan cult was funded as well. So you really have a sort of very much a sort of communal system, and that's very, very different from what comes later. Why there's no real sort of outcry about the change? First of all, I think it's just how long it takes. I mean, we're dealing with the best part of 2 centuries, and I really do think that most of the Constantinian lists in the Liber Pontificalis are late. And I mean, unlike Rosamond, I think that those lists are probably in the state that we have them are mid to late 6th century. They are changed even after the sort of basic outline of the Liber Pontificalis is put together. I think that one thing is just the very, very long period of change. Another thing is that at the sort of level of your ordinary community, your ordinary member of the Christian church, the sort of thing they're doing, the sort of wealth they're putting into the church is exactly what they would have done to their local gods anyway. I mean, if you look at the floor mosaics of northern Italy, which sort of tell you about how the churches are put up, it's that somebody has managed to provide 10 solidi, somebody's provided so-and-so solidi or whatever. Basically speaking, you're looking at small grants from the local community, from members of the local community. The big grants that come from the aristocracy come really at a moment when I mean, there's this huge change for the aristocracy in the 5th, 6th centuries. I mean, as the Western and Eastern empires split up, the aristocracy, which had been international, suddenly is in a much changed position. So Melania has estates in 90 provinces. By the end of sort of 410, how many of those estates she would have been able to access easily is very, very questionable. And of course, it gets worse as the successor states are developed. So a lot of aristocrats must have been in a position to thinking that, well, the family cannot access these estates any longer. We can give them to a church or whatever. So I think that for the majority of the population, they wouldn't really have noticed that they're not being asked to put large amounts of money into the institution. The institution gets really rich without them. The institution gets really rich because of the aristocracy, and it's the aristocracy that really sees a huge change.
Thank you. Any more questions? We still have some time. Shira?
Hello. Hi, thank you very much. I would like to ask, since you said that the endowments were more common in the late 5th and 6th centuries and 7th, I was wondering how and if the concern for heavenly well-being also had an impact on that matter.
Yeah, well, I mean, the issue about heavenly well-being is, I mean, Peter Brown has sort of sketched this out sort of superbly. The impact of you can get heavenly well-being by giving treasure, just as you can get heavenly well-being by giving land. So in that sense, the whole issue of the spiritual economy is slightly different and has a slightly different chronology from the changes in the actual landed economy. And that's one of the things that has struck me increasingly, that we've sort of, and I mean, I talked to Peter Brown about this, and he accepts that he hadn't put a chronology into it. But I think that basically the spiritual economy, the model of the spiritual economy is already being pretty fully set out by the end of the 4th century. And it's certainly very, very clear once you get through to Augustine and then throughout the 5th century. But in other words, that change, that the development of the notion of a spiritual economy, which is not so different from the notion of a spiritual economy involving pagan gods or any deity. That is there before the notion of a landed economy. So the notion of a landed economy is a later development than Brown's spiritual economy. Does that answer the?
So you are not saying that there is a difference, like that that heavenly well-being inspired more land giving to give.
Well, heavenly well-being inspires giving, but it doesn't tell you whether you're giving treasure or whether you're giving land. And it's really what leads you to give land is, well, the growing demands of the church from the late 5th and early 6th century onwards, and the arguments put forward by people like Augustine, Salvian. But then, I mean, it's really interesting that the great notion of the division of church income. This first comes to the fore, the quadripartum, in the 480s, 490s. The church doesn't legislate on how to divide its income before that.
Thank you.
Next, we have a question from Andre.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Wood, for this very, very interesting talk. I have a very basic question, and I just hope that it makes some sense. But to what extent could your assessment of the church's centrality in late antiquity be somehow biased by the fact that the bulk of the extant sources, both textual and material, to some extent, were transmitted when not produced entirely by the church? Thank you very much again.
So hang on. Can you just repeat that again? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, to what extent is this centrality of the church? Could it be biased by the fact that the sources we have, both textual and to some extent material, were actually transmitted and to a large extent produced by the church itself?
Yeah, that's obviously a fair point. But if you're looking, say, at my figures on church land and church income, the fact that it's pretty clear that we're dealing with around a third of the property of Western Europe in the hands of the church, no monarch has anything remotely close to that in the West. So it's not really terribly surprising that the church is the dominant voice and the dominant model. The aristocracy doesn't have the same unity. So the other thing is that, I mean, I think the extent to which the church becomes the state becomes ecclesiasticized, so that in fact the whole world is actually dominated by the church in a way that the whole Roman world was not dominated by any single religious cult or any religious cult at all. It's dominated by the emperor. I think that means that the church is bound to be a different sort of power. Now you can say, well, if we add all the aristocrats together, don't they come up to being something bigger than that? Well, the answer is, well, not really. And of course, most aristocrats are actually supporting the church in some way or other anyway. So I don't think there's a problem there. The other thing is that the church isn't just transmitting ecclesiastical material. I mean, all the non-ecclesiastical material that we have from the Roman Empire is transmitted to us by the church, because the church is transmitting everything. I don't think the church is as biased as you're implying. Does that sort of go some way towards answering your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next, we have a question from Carol Newman.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful paper. My question has to do with the relationship between the increasing centralization of land in the hands of the church and the very slow progression of the re-centralization of secular power. I'm wondering, since resources are never unlimited in any environment, and since land donations, land is the source of income for or support for the endeavors of secular rulers as much as for the church, whether the influx of land to the church is an inhibiting factor in the development of centralized political units in the period of the 7th and into the 8th century.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's why I think the 8th century is so important, because in a sense, the 8th century sees the Carolingians start to reverse that, and so in an odd way, the Carolingian period is less ecclesiastical than the Merovingian period is. But I think you're absolutely right that the church does become such a great landed power that it does actually Well, the kings don't actually realize how much they're giving away, how much they're allowing to be given away. And I think that really the early 8th century comes as a huge shock to secular power. I think that the arrival of Islam, the effect of and I mean, what's interesting is that most Islamic scholars would really downplay the numbers of troops in the Berber armies that crossed in 711. Well, if the Berbers are a lot smaller than we used to think, then the Christian armies must be a lot smaller, even smaller, and a lot more incompetent. And sort of recent work I've done on Charles Martel, I discovered to my surprise that Charles Martel only manages to survive because he's backed by Liutprand and the Lombards, something which is carefully hidden in all the Frankish sources, but when you work through the Lombard sources, it's there. So I think that the state does actually give away too much, particularly in Francia, in Spain and in England. The Lombards may be different because they've constantly got the Byzantines with a standing army on their doorstep. And one of the interesting, I mean, in the sort of fascicule of early medieval Europe that's coming out on the Temple Society, Paolo Tedesco and Merle Eisenberg have done an absolutely stunning job on the Lombard economy and how the church fits into that in a different way than it does in Francia and Spain.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Yannick Fox.
Hi, thanks so much for this really fascinating paper. My question is again about the Temple Society idea. From the Appadurai article, one thing that kind of shines through is the sheer diversity of actors participating in the ongoing liturgy and the cult. And when we compare this to at least ecclesiastical Western sources, what we get is primarily a view of like large benefactors and church staff. And also in the South Indian case, the process itself is very non-hierarchical. So I was wondering whether you think this is something that is also happening in the West, it's just that the sources don't reflect it. And also the interaction with a deity is as if it were a person, or at very least a legal entity. So should we compare this to maybe the patron saint in the case of the shrines of Gaul or comparable cases?
Well, certainly that last point I think probably holds true, that the gifts are to the patron and so on. The Appadurai, I mean, one of the things I would sort of instantly say about all the Temple Society models is that they all differ, and not everybody likes Appadurai and Appadurai Breckenridge, and some of the people who've written about North Indian societies have dealt with societies where kings and armies are very much more important than they are down in the Appadurai world. So I think there's one can sort of accept Temple Society without it having to follow the Appadurai model too closely. I think that I've forgotten how your question started now. I think there's a lot of leeway in the whole system of endowment, and to some extent, of course, I'm cheating because I'm to some extent I'm sort of challenging Brown's micro-Christendom's model and saying, hang on, we've got to put Christendom as a whole back into this, because Christendom as a whole is following a similar set of injunctions about how to redistribute wealth. I think there's a lot to be done with looking at these Temple Society models, not just, as I say, Appadurai. Also, some of the Chinese stuff is really interesting. The Chinese stuff is perhaps more useful when it comes to looking at monasteries, because there the big development is not with a state religion, despite Confucianism. It's with the Buddhist temples, and there's been some really interesting stuff about certain regions dominated by temples. But there, it's not the state as a whole; it's particular regions and particular holy regions. But yeah, I mean, this is only a sort of what I hope will be a sort of starting point for discussion, and I hope that the Marxists will actually chuck feudalism entirely and put temple society in its proper place. So I thought there might have been a scream from Paolo there, but.
Well, please join me again in thanking Eowyn for such a wonderful and stimulating talk. We will end the discussion here. And we will soon circulate the schedule for the 2021-2022 academic year. So stay tuned. And I wish you all a wonderful, productive, healthy summer. And we will see you all in October. Bye-bye.
And thank you, Shachar and Moore, for organizing this forum. It was fantastic, and it's getting more and more followers from all over the world. So good job.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.